Shut up and sit down.
I'm Professor Matthew Brashears. I'm an Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of South Carolina. I routinely teach the undergrad methods course. That's the Sociology 303. I teach the undergraduate theory course. I teach a special topics course on covert social networks. In my covert social networks class, I talk about organizations that are trying to accomplish some kind of goal but are trying to remain partially or completely hidden while they do it. At the low end, we look at men who are having anonymous homosexual sex in public bathrooms, how women obtained abortions pre-Roe v. Wade, corporate malfeasance networks. Then we typically end up with transnational jihadist terrorism, so Al-Qaeda, ISIS, things like that. My sub-areas are social network analysis, social psychology, and then what's loosely is called military sociology. So it's sociology having to do with defense applications. In particular, I'm interested in memory processes in social networks and how we think about social networks that influences our behavior. I'm interested in how we influence each other without necessarily having direct contact with each other. And I'm interested in how information flows through networks and is changed by the experience and changes the network as a result. One of the things that I study is error and error correction in networks. So it's this idea that when we pass information from person to person, that sometimes we screw up. But we don't just make mistakes, and that's like the old children's game of telephone. When we make a mistake or we recognize that we've heard something that's probably a little wonky, we often error correct. We try to substitute what we think the message actually was. Now, when children do this in the game of telephone, they're often exaggerating for humorous effect. When adults do this, they're not exaggerating, but they may make mistakes in their error correction anyway, and that can produce some interesting results. So I had published some research, and it was getting some attention in the news media. And there was some, a little press release on this, released by my university, and it started getting picked up by various news outlets. And so the first news outlet had a quote for me and then identified, me as, Matthew Brashears of Cornell University, which is my previous institution. But then a little while later, I went from Professor Brashears of Cornell University to Mr. Brashears of Cornell University. So I lost my doctorate. And then a couple more news articles later, as moving from newspaper to newspaper, it becomes Professor Brashears of Cornwell University. And then a couple more stories after that, it became Mr. Brashears of Cornwell University, United Kingdom. So over the course of a series of news articles, my title, my affiliation, and my nationality were all changed by journalists who hypothetically are trying to convey information as accurately as possible. Now, of course, these were minor details in the story, and the basic gist of the story was consistent, but I thought it was really fun to see that process play out over a sequence of different online publications. This is a running joke with social network researchers because the area has been around since really the mid-20th century. And then social network sites came along, and the result of this is everyone thinks that's what we study, to the point that at our major conference I've joked we should sell t-shirts that say, "No, actually, I don't study Facebook." It's funny to us. The thing about Facebook and social media sites is they are a kind of social contact, but they're not social contact itself. The map is not the territory. And part of the reason for that is people present a vision of themselves online, and it's a curated vision. So people don't post on Facebook or Instagram or whatever the current social media site of choice is about the stupid thing they did today and the embarrassing thing they did today and how they are failures. They might post something where they're trolling for sympathy or for people to tell them how great they are. They post things that make their lives look amazing. And we know that with the popularity of filters on selfies and whatnot, people are trying very hard to curate this vision of their lives that they can share with others. So when you try to study social media, you have to do it with an awareness that this is not the social world. This is this very designed version of the social world. And if you want to understand what people are really doing, you have to find ways of penetrating beneath that shell. Now, it is useful for studying how information spreads, and that's something that's very interesting, but there's a lot of challenges to that. And one of the big challenges is we usually don't get to study more than one modality at a time. So one example of this I use with my students is I text with my wife a lot, but I don't Facebook message her. I Facebook message my sister pretty frequently, but I email my parents. And work colleagues typically email me, but occasionally text me. And I hardly ever talk to anyone on the phone because I hate talking to people on the phone. So if you were to just observe one of those modalities, just texting, just Facebook messaging, just email, you would get a radically different perspective of what my actual social network looks like. So when we try to track how information spreads over networks, we can only see the information that exists in that modality. And if it jumps into another one and then comes back later, that looks like it's just appearing somewhere else in the network when in fact it's describing a trajectory that we could study. So it's incredibly useful. There's a lot you can do with it, but it's far more limited than people usually think. It would probably be, you will always benefit from having a better understanding of how people work in groups and how society functions. And the basic reason for that is, regardless of what you see on TV, regardless of what you might read in books, regardless of what you might have heard from your parents, nothing important gets done by individuals. Everything meaningful happens in groups. Every great scientist who made a difference had people working with him or her and was in contact with others. Everyone who built something built it with other people. And if you don't understand how to work with other people, then it makes it hard for you to accomplish anything important either. Humans throughout our history have had to confront challenges. And we face a number of very significant existential challenges right now, including global climate change, transnational terrorism, political upheaval, and so forth. But what's interesting about the current period is that, by and large, the most serious threats that we face are fundamentally social or socio-technical. They're not strictly engineering tasks or physical science tasks. So with dealing with climate change, at least half the problem is how we socially make adjustments to the way that we live in order to arrest this process. And we're dealing with something like transnational terrorism. Military solutions or kinetic solutions are stalling tactics, but they don't solve the thing that generates the insurgents in the first place. And in order to do that, you have to grapple with the social challenges that are in play. What we as a society need to understand more about is simply how humans actually work in groups, not how we would like to think we work in groups, not how we want to work in groups, because wishful thinking doesn't get us anywhere. We need to actually understand how humans go about reacting to power and status and where these things come from and how they shape our structures. Because if we don't figure that out, then it's going to be very difficult to solve ththese problems that are frankly threatening our civilization and our species as a whole.